Hello, hello, and welcome to the first episode of the Sideshow Prodigies podcast, a podcast dedicated to honoring and preserving the rich history of famous and obscure sideshow performers and why they continue to be influential to this day. I am your host, Amanda Surrett. For anyone wanting to learn more information, as well as the sources I've used, you can check out the Reddit community I've made at r/SideshowPerformer. Thank you. A few key things before I get started. What are sideshows? Sideshows are live shows that were traditionally performed off to the side of circuses and carnivals. They were often located on the midway, which was the stretch of area between the entrance of a circus and the main big top tent. Sideshows usually advertised by way of giant 8-foot by 9-foot or larger hand-painted banners that depicted the performers within the shows. These banners would typically portray these performers by emphasizing their physical differences. Sideshows usually consisted of 10 short individual acts where each performer would demonstrate their different skills and talents. They traditionally employed people born with noticeable physical differences who would exhibit themselves in front of audiences by drawing attention to their bodies. However, a lot of performers began incorporating their own artistic, linguistic, or gymnastics talents to draw the crowd's attention, and soon many were known for their different talents rather than how they looked. There are currently a couple traditional multi-act sideshows still in operation, although these almost exclusively focus on performers who have learned specialty talents such as contortion, sword swallowing, and fire eating. An example of a sideshow that is still around is the Coney Island Sideshow by the Seashore in Brooklyn, New York, which I have actually gone to see in person and was very entertaining to watch, because it was performed and demonstrated in a very inclusive, fun, and exciting way. The crowd is encouraged to cheer and celebrate the performers. So without further ado, it's time to introduce the subject of this episode, Grace McDaniel, one of the kindest women in the world. Grace McDaniel is born Grace May McCannon to Daniel Sylvester and Martha Jane McCannon on March 17, 1888, in Numa, Appanoose County, Iowa, a very small town that currently has under 100 permanent residents. Her father, Daniel, is an American Civil War veteran and accomplished bridge contractor and builder. He's famous throughout the area for his skills. At one point, he works for the Traylon Bridge Company, which is located not too far from Numa, where the family lived. A news article from the Omaha World Herald on January 8, 1892, mentions that he's helped to build at least 27 bridges in the Pottawatomie, Iowa area, and has secured the contract to build bridges in the Omaha, Nebraska area as well. I wish I could find exactly where these bridges once stood, but they seem to have since been relabeled or taken down. He has an interest in real estate as well, which he seems to have taught Grace about. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find anything about her mother, Martha Jane Haxby, but new information might pop up at some point. Grace is born with a very noticeable facial condition that causes her lips to swell up a lot, especially the skin around her upper lip. This condition has been attributed to Sturge-Weber syndrome, a congenital disorder that affects the face and central nervous system and is often associated with port wine stains or tumors on the face. She's never formally diagnosed with any specific condition during her lifetime, and the only information we have about her condition from Grace herself comes from her pitch card, which says, "My remarkable facial condition is a birthmark, due to confusion in the capillaries and nervous system." I'll be revisiting Grace's pitch card a little later. Her facial condition causes her to have difficulty speaking clearly in her early years, but as she gets older, she becomes more adept at it. She is the youngest of 9 children, and seems to have been the child who sticks with her parents the most. Her siblings include Jeanette, called Nettie, George, Robert, Cora, Ida, Charles, Daniel, and Harvey. Sadly, Ida passes away very young. She's only 3 years old and dies 8 years before Grace is even born. Then her oldest sister, Nettie, who was 20 years older than her, sadly dies 3 days after Grace's first birthday. I found all of this information on Grace's Find a Grave listing. I can't imagine how difficult it must have been for the family at this time. Ida was only 3, and I'm sure her parents loved her a lot. And it's so tragic to have another child die right after their youngest daughter's birthday. They go from celebrating only a couple of days before to having another heart-wrenching event happen to them. I know there's a high infant mortality rate at the time, but it's never not saddening. I wish we knew what Grace's early years were like. Did she have any friends? I hope she did. Did she enjoy reading? Did she like growing up in a farming community? Were there games she enjoyed playing? Did she have a favorite book or a favorite toy or a favorite doll? There's so much we don't know, and it's frustrating because I feel that these are parts of her life that should be remembered. I simultaneously love and am frustrated while researching. I love finding out about all of this new information, and it feels good to correct misinformation, especially since there's so much rampant misinformation out there related to this field of interest. But it's also frustrating with how little information there is available. I've written to the Appanoose County Historical Society, since Numa is so small that Appanoose County encompasses it, hoping that they would possibly have some more information about Grace's upbringing there. Sadly, I haven't received a response to my email, and I was really looking forward to hearing from them too. Here is some history of Numa, Iowa, the town that Grace grows up in. It's a very small community located within Appanoose County in Iowa. Numa and Appanoose County at large are farming communities, and would have been similar in the late 1800s. When I say Numa is really small, I mean it's tiny. The closest city is Centerville, Iowa, which in and of itself is also pretty small, with only 5,500 residents as of 2020. Centerville is known for being a coal mining hub in the late 1800s and early 1900s and attracts a lot of European immigrants looking for stable jobs. Numa itself is known for having had the largest mine in Appanoose County. Sadly, a fire ravages the area and the mine is destroyed in 1907. Tragically, Grace's mother, Martha, dies in 1912 when Grace is about 24. I wish there was more known about Grace's relationship with her mother. Unfortunately, I can't even find any information on Martha through the newspaper archives I use. About a year or so later, Grace, her brother Daniel, and their father packed their bags and moved to Katy, Texas, a town located on the outskirts of Houston, Texas. Katy, Texas is about 29 miles west of central Houston. The town gets its name from the famous MKT Railroad that spanned through Missouri, Kentucky, and Texas. Eventually, Missouri is dropped, and as such, the M in MKT is also dropped. It's this abbreviated KT Railroad that soon becomes known as, in quotes, the Katy, that the town adopts due to its close proximity to the railroad. In addition to being a railroad town, it's also a farming town known for its rice production. The soil is especially fertile due to the town being located near the Buffalo Bayou floodplain, which makes it a perfect area for rice farming. There's initially an effort to specialize in cotton, corn, and peanut farming, and while all of these crops were successful, they don't have the same oomph that the rice has. The town becomes very prosperous from its farming endeavors, and soon several stores, saloons, and hotels are built. It seems that this rising success would continue with more and more people moving and settling permanently in the town. That is until September of 1900. When the deadliest hurricane in American history, the Galveston hurricane, roars through Katy, Texas. All that remains of the town after the damage has been done are 3 original houses left standing. Since then, the town has been through 6 other hurricanes, but none as catastrophic as the one in 1900. The town made a lot of effort to rebuild, and by 1913, it's restored to much of its former glory. Katy is currently considered a subset of Houston due to Houston's expanding population. I've also written to the Katy, Texas Historical Society, and guess what? I also haven't heard back from them. It's so unfortunate. I'll take any response. Even if they have no information, it'd be nice to at least hear back. Between 1912 and 1924, her father remarries. His second wife's name is Hannah J., but I'm having trouble finding more details about her. It's now around 1916, about 3 or so years since the McCannons have moved to Katy, Texas, and Grace meets a farmer named Harry McDaniel, who's originally from Glenwood, Alabama, though there's a chance he was from Arkansas, which I will get to. All of the details surrounding how they meet have been lost to time, but hopefully they're revealed at some point. Grace and Harry are married on May 28th, 1917 in Houston, Texas, and Grace becomes Grace McDaniel. Side note, I'm not sure where the extra S in her married name comes from. Her husband is Harry McDaniel, but Grace is repeatedly referred to as Grace McDaniels with an S. She is 29 years old and he is 40 or 41. Now I want to pause for a few moments to explain a major piece of misinformation that's often attributed to and repeated in regards to Grace's life, which is that she never formally married and is taken advantage of by a drunk carnival worker in 1917, becomes pregnant, and is forced to have the baby, which is her son Elmer. This information is repeated over and over again in modern online articles about Grace. I really have no idea where this information originally stems from, but I can say with 100% certainty that this series of events are not true. It's a rumor that frankly feels very harmful. I feel it implies that the author thinks that someone like Grace could never have a healthy relationship with someone, in quotes, normal, because of how she looks, and that the only people who'd want to be with someone like her would be horrible and sleazy human beings who don't view her as a person. I don't understand why this rumor was ever created in the first place, because it paints Grace as this woman who experiences trauma after trauma and who never has any happiness in her life. If events had played out like this, of course I wouldn't judge her for it, but it feels wrong for that rumor to have spread as much as it has when the entire thing isn't true. I hope I'm explaining myself well enough. It's just something that bothers me. Just because someone may look or act incredibly different from how other people look and act doesn't mean that they can't have happy relationships. I want to lay to rest the rumor as well as to explain that lots and lots of Sideshow Prodigies have had strong, loving relationships and marriages with people who truly see them as individuals and aren't with them for ulterior motives. As I mentioned before, Grace is married to Harry McDaniel on May 28, 1917. And we know this for sure because not only do we have a marriage certificate for the two of them, but their marriage is also reported on in at least 2 local papers on May 29, 1917. Several contemporary newspapers and other government documents spanning from 1920 to 1950 corroborate the fact that she is indeed married. The two of them moved to a farm on the outskirts of Katy, Texas, which is described as being a very piney part of rural Texas, where they settle and live for several years. In April of 1918, Grace gives birth to their son Elmer, whose full name is Daniel Elmer McDaniel, which means that Grace names their son after her brother Daniel. And I think that's a very cute fact, because her brother's name was Daniel Elmer McCannon, and she names her son Daniel Elmer McDaniel. She clearly cares about her family a lot. I've seen a few references that they may have also had a daughter named Pearl, but I can't find any record of this in any historical document. And on Grace's pitch card that she sells at her shows, there's no mention of her either. So my thought is that this is a different Grace McDaniel and not our Grace McDaniel. In 1921, Grace and Harry are listed in one of their local Texas newspapers as being part of some real estate transfers, which makes me think that Harry may have sold some acreage of land he owned and had the money transferred to Grace. In the same article, this is not related at all, but in the same article I found a news report of the largest lemon that the county had ever seen, weighing in at 1 pound and 7 ounces. I just thought it was really funny that people wanted to report on that for that day, so that's why I mention it. I'm also happy to say that I've pinpointed the year that Grace begins her sideshow career. She officially joins Morris and Castle Circus in 1923 and performs at the Louisiana State Fair that same year. Thankfully, Harry and Elmer accompany her during the start to her career, and I imagine that having her family there for moral support brings her comfort and gives her confidence to begin this new endeavor. She did not begin her sideshow career out of necessity either, as is often rumored. The showman working for Morris and Castle had to convince her to join their show. With the Shreveport Journal reporting in October of 1923, She, being a very highly educated woman, industrious and well-talented in the art of the needle, it was very hard indeed to offer her enough inducements to make it worthwhile for her to travel with these shows. After several trips by the manager of this attraction to her home, and after a lengthy correspondence, terms were finally agreed upon, and she and her family joined the first of this season, and from what she says, she is very glad to have taken this step in life, as she has gained much knowledge in traveling all over this country, an opportunity she has never had. What it sounds like happened is that one of the showmen working for Morris and Castle overhears word of a woman with an extremely noticeable facial condition living near Houston, Texas, and is determined to have her join the show. It doesn't appear that Grace is under any financial duress at this time and has no reason to want to leave Texas. So the showman has to go back several times and probably has to keep raising the weekly pay rate until Grace agrees. One thing is for sure, she is not a desperate woman and has a lot of self-respect. Morris and Castle Circus was a traveling show that primarily made stops at state fairs and other similar venues. What I find to be especially interesting about Grace working for this circus in particular is that one of the main showmen and promoters employed is Johnny Bijano, who's described as being the dean of all circus managers. Bijano had recently adopted a 6-year-old Emmett Driggers, who was born with a form of ichthyosis, which caused his skin to painfully crack and harden unless he kept it well moisturized. These hardened patches of skin resembled scales. Emmett would soon adopt the surname Bijano and would go on to marry Priscilla Lawther, and the two of them would have their own successful sideshow act as a couple. I've written about Priscilla and Emmett many times in the Sideshow Performer Reddit community, and I love finding out new information about them because they were a very loving and devoted couple. What I wonder is if Grace and Emmett had met while she was working for Morris and Castle, since Emmett would have been around 6 years old in 1923, and that's when he first started performing. So there's a chance that the two of them knew each other, and I think that would be very sweet if they did. Grace continues working for Morris and Castle until 1929, and almost always travels with Harry and Elmer. Sadly, her father dies in October of 1924, which hits Grace hard. Interestingly, I was able to find his will because of an appeal made by Daniel McCannon, Grace's brother, to overturn some aspects of the will in relation to Daniel Sylvester, their father's second wife, Hannah. Apparently, Grace's brother had considered his father to have been too ill of health to understand what he was agreeing to or the extent of his property. The McCannon family felt that Hannah had had too much influence over Daniel Sylvester as he was writing the will. However, the appeal was denied and the will was not admitted to probate. Grace unfortunately faces some cruelty from the press during her performing days, which is something that many sideshow performers at the time deal with. There are articles describing her condition in a very harsh and dehumanizing way. She's referred to as the ugliest woman and the mule-faced woman in articles that were written about her. I don't want to focus too much on these negative nicknames and descriptions of her. The only moniker she ever tolerates is the mule-faced woman, which she begins using at the start of her career as a performer, and even then it's a toleration and not something she wants to be remembered by. As an adult, Grace is described as being the kindest and most maternal woman to ever appear in sideshows. Even the articles that harshly describe her physicality cannot say a single bad thing about her when it comes to her personality. She is kind and humble and always makes everyone feel welcome. She's the type of person to take people under her wing if they seem shy or quiet. People who initially experienced a shock upon first meeting her completely change their tune by the time their conversation is over, often describing her as being very motherly and intellectual. Here are some things that people have said about her. William Gresham, an author who wrote an article about Grace, describes her as, quote, a homespun, motherly soul, generous to a fault. After 5 minutes conversation with Grace, you forget all about the strange contours of her face and are aware only of the warm and courageous heart of the woman herself, end quote. Her friend and fellow performer, Dolly Regan, describes her as, quote, the kindliest woman in the world, end quote. A circus hand who had worked with Grace, Edward Malone, describes her saying, quote, Grace was always one of the most pleasant women I ever knew, end quote. In 1933, Grace begins working at the Chicago World's Fair as part of the Robert Ripley's Auditorium, spelled ODD Itorium. For some context, the 1933 Chicago World's Fair, also called the Century of Progress International Exposition, was a year-long expo that operated as both a centennial celebration of the city as well as a standard World's Fair that brought together people, culture, history, science, and art all in one place. I've always found World's Fairs to be fascinating, and I do always enjoy when my niche interests align in this way. Each World's Fair also has an overarching theme. In this case, the theme was, quote, "Science finds, industry applies, man conforms," end quote, which sounds a lot more dystopian than I think they were intending, and it sounds like something straight out of George Orwell's 1984. This expo also provides guests with a small escape from the troubles of the Great Depression. It's described that there were outpourings of people looking to attend the fair and viewing it as a fantasy they could live in for a while. Some of the standout attractions include futuristic car and train concepts, robots that could, quote, smoke cigarettes, as I mentioned before, a Ripley's Believe It or Not auditorium, a miniature, quote, city in which 60 people born with forms of dwarfism were hired to, quote, live, an exhibit about incubators in which real babies were inside, an orchestra made up of 100 people playing marimbas, a roller coaster, and a German dirigible that circled around the expo for a few hours, successfully landed, and then successfully took off again to get ahead of some bad weather that was approaching. All of the buildings constructed for the fair are painted in several different colors, which eventually earns the fair the nickname the Rainbow City. This directly references the earlier 1893 Chicago World's Fair that was nicknamed the White City for all of the buildings that had been painted white. Some of the other key themes of this fair include progress, technology, innovation, and utopia. I imagine Grace had never seen anything on the same scale as this fair, being that she was from a very small farming town in Iowa, moving to a town on the outskirts of Houston, Texas, and then seeing just how expansive the grounds at the Chicago World's Fair were. A person would walk through the front gate and cross over the bridge that was a part of Lake Michigan to get to the rest of the fair and would be greeted by a prismatic display of some of the finest modern architecture. It must have been quite something. The Ripley's Auditorium that Grace performs at is actually the first iteration of what would later become the permanent Ripley's Believe It or Not museums, though this auditorium does not stay in a fixed place after the fair and instead goes on tour for a few years. The first permanent auditorium opens in Manhattan in 1939. Interestingly, there's another sideshow at the fair that is competing with Ripley's. The competition comes in the form of Harry Lewiston's sideshow, where Grace actually works a bit later in her career. Lewiston's sideshow apparently does not fare as well compared to Ripley's and closes down not too long after it opens. These sideshows are located in the Midway area of the fair, which also includes all sorts of little curio shops, oddities displays, nightclubs, and singing performances. Apparently, both Judy Garland and the Andrews sisters found a lot of success for their singing careers here. But I really question how this original Ripley's Auditorium is promoted by the Sideshow Barker specifically. It's described that one of the Barkers, nicknamed, in quotes, the Professor, constantly laughs and makes fun of Grace by whinnying like a horse, and attendants at this specific sideshow occasionally bring piles of hay for her. The same Barker also makes comments about another performer by the name of Harry, who is part of the show as a, quote, ossified man. After months of this treatment, the performers no longer wanted to hear it, and for good reason, too. From his description in most articles, this professor character seems to have been annoying to most people, though I'm sure there are some embellishments in such articles. As undignified as this experience may have been for Grace, there's at least one silver lining. She meets and becomes friends with another well-known performer, Frida Pushnik, who's only about 9 years old at the time, and her mother. Frida is born without arms or legs, with the exception of an arm nub. She's very popular at the Chicago World's Fair, and from what I've read, it sounds like Grace watched over Frida and helped her with school lessons when her mother had to go out. Frida is also a remarkable person, and I will be covering her life in a future podcast episode. In addition to Frida, several other well-known performers get their start at this fair. Martha Morris, known for her film appearance in Todd Browning's Freaks and is born without arms, so she uses her legs and feet to accomplish daily tasks. Betty Lou Williams, who's born with a parasitic twin who grew from her abdomen, and Robert Wadlow, known for being the tallest man in recorded history at 8'11", being a few examples. Barney Nelson, an accomplished artist who is born without lower arms and hands, also makes an appearance, though he's already an established performer at this time. I'll make podcast episodes for all of these people. One showman remarked that performers would often do what they could to hide their physical differences from people while riding public transport to and from the fair, mainly buses to and from the main circus and sideshow area. While out and about, Grace typically wore a veil that covered the bottom half of her face. After the fair, Grace goes on tour with the traveling Ripley's Auditorium for a few years, at least until 1937, based on newspaper articles I've found. After which she joins Harry Lewiston's Sideshow, which was known for pairing up with other venues such as the Johnny J. Jones Exposition and other similar large circuses/expos. Another piece of misinformation I want to correct is the claim that Grace wins a, quote, ugliest women contest in 1935, and that's how she gets the job with Harry Lewiston. This doesn't line up with the available facts corroborated by newspapers. The truth is that she works for the Traveling Ripley's Believe It or Not exhibit until at least 1937. If she has this stable job, I don't see why she would drop out to join a contest that she'd inevitably dislike. Despite scouring several newspaper archive websites, I haven't seen any mention of her ever winning any sort of contest like this. If anyone can actually confirm that this contest did happen, feel free to correct me. What actually seems to have happened is that she worked for the Traveling Ripley's exhibit after the 1933 World's Fair and is contacted in 1937 by Harry Lewiston, the very famous showman and promoter I mentioned who had competed with Ripley's at the fair. Harry has just created his own sideshow with his wife and is looking for performers to join them. He specifically seeks out performers who had worked at the 1933 World's Fair. Since Grace would have recognized her old colleagues, it would make sense for her to join this new sideshow. If Grace already knows everyone who she'd be working with, and Harry Lewiston himself, a showman with a very impressive history, asks her to join, I don't see why she'd need to enter a contest that would only further draw negative attention to her physical difference. Harry Lewiston was a famous showman and promoter who had worked with several different sideshow managers who were employed by larger circuses such as Barnum and Bailey. Lewiston himself had more or less run off to join the circus at age 14. After working his way up, he makes a name for himself as a showman and has earned a good rep with the circuses he works for. In the late 1930s, Lewiston and his wife branched off from the Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus to create their own independent sideshow venture, which he advertised as being a traveling museum and promoted under several different names, such as, quote, World's Fair Freaks and, quote, Parade of Oddities. There seems to have been a bit of confusion with these names, especially World's Fair Freaks, as these performers are promoted with the slogan, quote, as seen at Ripley's Auditorium at the 1933 World's Fair. It seems that Ripley's name is either being thrown around quite loosely or that Harry Lewiston has made a business deal with Ripley. Either way, Grace begins a years-long career with the World's Fair Freaks sideshow working for Lewiston. It's at this sideshow that she finds friends and fellow performers such as Dolly Regan, who had a condition that caused her body to ossify, and Priscilla and Emmett Bijano. Priscilla was born with hypertrichosis, and Emmett was born with ichthyosis. These three performers I've just mentioned are all known as being some of the sweetest people to have ever worked in sideshows. By October of 1939, Grace is living with Elmer at the Carr Hotel in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, while traveling with Lewiston's Sideshow. I was curious and did some digging, and apparently the location of this hotel is now an adult care facility, and unfortunately I can't find any pictures of what it once looked like. Elmer gets married to an Anna Karekes while they were staying at the hotel, and according to his marriage certificate, Harry McDaniels has died sometime prior to 1939. I believe Harry may have died around 1936. as an article about Grace originating from the same year mentions that she was, quote, once married instead of referring to her as being currently married in present tense. I also want to bring up that same thing about where Harry McDaniels is born, because on Elmer McDaniel's marriage certificate, it says that Harry was born in Arkansas, which I think is interesting because in 2 census records, Harry is said to have been from Alabama, so just interesting to keep that in mind. Grace continues working for Harry Lewiston, and as of 1948, she still owns her home in Katy, Texas, where she lives during the Sideshow off-season. The article in which I found this information also claims that she is one of the few performers to own a house, but this happens a lot more often than the author of the article is aware of. By 1950, she and Elmer are residing in Tampa, Florida during the circus off-season, as a lot of other performers choose to do. While living in Florida, Elmer takes up a job as a yellow cab company driver and is a part of the Greater Tampa Showmen's Association. Elmer has also been Grace's manager for several years. After all the research I've done, there's one more piece of information I'm curious about. See, in the online articles that include misinformation about Grace's life, they also mention that Elmer is a horrible alcoholic and morphine addict who regularly steals Grace's earnings and uses her money to pay off his debts. So now I'm starting to wonder if this is also a rumor that was started later on, and it's for this reason that I don't want to report this information as fact until I have the evidence to prove or disprove. I have some good news, however. I've ordered Harry Lewiston's autobiography since he spent many years working with Grace, which means that he also spent time with Elmer as well. And if anyone were to have the information I'm looking for, it would be Harry Lewiston. After I receive the book, I will give an update in the next episode. It's in the early 1950s that she transfers from Lewiston's show to another sideshow run by showman Dick Best, a notable figure within the circus industry. His work primarily involved the management of sideshows for the Royal American Shows Circus, and is responsible for encouraging several well-known performers to go into sideshow work. During her time with Best, she also worked with such performers as Betty Lou Williams and Francesco Lentini, both of whom were born with parasitic twins that gave them extra limbs. She departs from the show around 1957 and continues living in Florida. By this time, she is retired from the sideshow business and continues traveling for fun. Sadly, she becomes very ill while staying in Chicago in 1958, and on July 29th of that year, she passes away at the hospital there. Her body is soon transferred to Florida, where a funeral is held at the Myrtle Hill Cemetery in Tampa. She was 70 years old. Her son, Elmer, dies not too long after her in 1964 at the Tampa, Florida hospital at the age of 46. He is survived by his wife, Anna. I greatly admire Grace for her kindness, her humility, and her inner strength. She truly seems like she was a wonderful woman, and this is the reason I want to set the record straight in terms of misinformation that's been said about her. Repeating misinformation makes it much harder to find the truth, and the truth is often way more interesting than whatever misinformation there is. Sideshow performers' lives have been riddled with so much shock value that even now there are articles and posts that focus on the shock and the weird. There is nothing ever actually shocking or weird. Many of these prodigies led ordinary lives when they were not performing. They had families and friends, many of them got married, and they had beloved pets. And everyone deserves to be remembered for their lives and their accomplishments, and how they were as people. Their physical differences are all secondary to how their personalities were. I think that talking about these amazing people, like Grace, in a podcast format is so important because an audio format removes the visual aspect that so many people are used to with sideshow performers. If there's any shock, it will not be related to people's physical or mental differences. If anything, it will only relate to the events that took place in their lives. Thank you for listening. I want to leave off on the short biography present on her pitch card that she sold at her shows in 1950. I was born on a farm near Numa, Iowa in 1888, 5 feet tall and weigh 115 pounds. The best medical talent of the United States and Canada have had me before them repeatedly, for close examination and scrutiny. My remarkable facial condition is a birthmark, due to a confusion in the capillary, arterial, and nervous systems previous to my birth. My father, mother, sisters, and brothers were normal folks in every way, just good, healthy people. I lead a normal life, prefer housekeeping, although the show life is an enjoyable one and healthful. I have one son, Elmer, 32 years of age, perfectly normal. Mrs. Grace McDaniel.